Good morning, everybody. Morning. First of all, a huge welcome to the conference today, Labour Market 2020, hosted by Policy Exchange. I'd like to say, first of all, huge thanks to Microsoft for hosting us here today. What I think everyone will agree is a great building, great surroundings to be speaking about these important issues. Also to Ingeus and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation for sponsorship of today's event. We usually save these sorts of thanks to the end, but I also want to thank our events team at Policy Exchange for the huge amount of hard work they've done to put together today's event. A bit of housekeeping first. There are no fake fires planned today, so if you do hear an alarm, follow the signs, and the muster point is outside Marks and Spencer's. So, as you know, today is the release of the labour market stats, and we have very quickly printed them off, and I can reveal that the employment rate has risen slightly, the unemployment rate has fallen slightly, and the claimant count has actually gone up a tiny little bit. So there'll be more details, I'm sure, on those things throughout today. So what's today about? Today is about trying to work out what to do with the future of the labour market. I think many would argue that in the kind of previous 15 years, perhaps we got a bit too complacent. We thought we'd fix the labour market like we'd fixed boom and bust, and like we'd fixed inflation. We thought that, with a relatively flexible labour market, with in-work tax credits, with a relatively modern system of employment support through Job Centre Plus, that the problems we've seen in the past of high unemployment and inactivity had gone. And I think there's the evidence today is that that is not true. Firstly, in terms of cyclical issues, we've seen the recession leading to high unemployment, falling living standards, and many people workless, as we've seen in the recent years. But also, I'd argue that this isn't just a cyclical issue. The rate of working age people on out-of-work benefits is the same today as it was in the height of the boom in 2004. There's 5.5 million adults in workless households, 2 million children in workless households. These things aren't a reflection of a labour market, I would argue, that is functioning as well as it could. And I think that's a challenge for us today, to work out how we get from where we are now to a place where we can start to talk about full employment, start to talk about rising living standards, and start to think about bringing the most disadvantaged people in our society into work and into prosperity. I think, and a lot of the work the Policy Exchange does, and this is why it's so important, it's about looking to the future and saying, actually, huge reforms are needed. We know there's a lot of reforms going on at the moment, but a lot more are going to be needed if we're going to reach and actually achieve those goals. And my argument is that this is going to take cross-party consensus, potentially. We're going to need both sides of the House of Commons to accept that there's problems in the labour market and think about, constructively, solutions that we might take forward together. And that's why I'm hugely pleased to have Stephen Timms here today, Shadow Minister for Employment, to speak about these issues and give the Labour perspective. And I think without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Stephen.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm delighted to be here. And let me just at the outset commend the consistent commitment of Matthew and his colleagues at Policy Exchange to using evidence and to innovation in policy making. I think those commitments are extremely valuable. And let me also welcome the contribution of Ingeus to supporting people into work in the work programme, and the sponsorship today of Microsoft, hospitality from Microsoft, and support from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation as well. We just heard a welcome, modest fall in unemployment. It's been announced this morning, but nobody is going to deny that we have today a crisis of unemployment. Women's unemployment, youth unemployment, over 50s unemployment, all at record highs. IPPR forecast last week another 100,000 people likely to become unemployed in the coming year, and the Office for Budget Responsibility suggested that the dole queues aren't seriously going to start to fall until September 2013 at the earliest. And in the short term, government policy is a big part of the problem. David Cameron told us his strategy in June 2010. The government was going to scrap measures Labour introduced before the election, which were stimulating growth and getting people, particularly young people, into jobs. All that was going to go. Instead, there would be a single-minded focus on eliminating the deficit within one parliament. Yes, public sector jobs would go, but they'd be more than made up for by a surge of renewed confidence, new investment, and new job creation in the private sector. That was the theory that we were presented with. But it hasn't happened. Private sector confidence is on the floor. Last year, 44,000 more jobs were lost in the public sector than were created in the private. The government now recognises the deficit will not be eliminated in this parliament, and in fact we're going to borrow £150 billion more up to 2015 than was forecast in June 2010. Now, it isn't the case that the government is doing nothing. On the contrary, we've got the work programme, introduction of universal credit and welfare reform, the investment in apprenticeships. The aims of all those are laudable: to reduce frictional unemployment, activate more people into the labour market, improve workforce skills. And on behalf of the opposition, I want to underline that we support those principles. But the wider economic failure is putting the aims of those policies at the moment beyond reach. And I think the problem is that ministers are presenting those policies, those three policies in particular, as panaceas for problems they cannot in fact begin to resolve. Wider economic failure poses an insurmountable hurdle to the aims of those initiatives. And as we see that those policies aren't delivering what it was hoped they would deliver, I think we need to recognise the problem isn't so much with them as with the wider economic policy problems. The work programme, first of all, builds on the flexible New Deal, uses payment by results. That idea has been taken rather further, I think in a sensible way, by the work programme compared with the programme in the past. The principles, I think, are right, as is the black box approach to individualise support. But the detail has, I think, been messed up. It was rushed in nationwide. There wasn't any piloting beforehand. The government paid out over £60 million needlessly to buy out existing flexible New Deal contracts. It started across the country last June, but in reality, in many areas, because going from a standing start was necessary, it meant it was going to take 3 months or more to get going, and we estimate that some 86,000 people who would have got into work last summer didn't do so because of that hiatus. And that's probably a lasting increase in unemployment and a completely unnecessary one. Amongst other things, work programme subcontracts with voluntary sector providers were presented as a way to make up for government cuts in charity support. The work programme was going to save the big society. Voluntary and community sector providers would be at the heart of its delivery. It was going to build on the 30% of welfare to work activity that the Hawkhead Review identified as being carried out previously by the voluntary sector. But at the launch in May of last year, there were 508 voluntary sector providers in the supply chain. That sounded promising. At the last count, that number was down to 412, and far from increasing from 30%, it appears that only 20% of the activity was being delivered by the voluntary sector. And the problem here, I think, is a loss of employment support capacity at a time when the labour market needs all the help it can get. The employment minister has gone from saying, as he did initially, if the big guys stuff the little guys, we'll stuff the big guys. That was his initial take on all of this. Now he's saying, quoting again, the deals that are done between subcontractors and prime contractors are entirely down to them. But this does matter. As the Minister used to point out, voluntary and community sector providers have expertise to help the hardest to reach in their own communities. If they go to the wall, the labour market will work less well. Ministers, I think, need to make sure the Merlin standards, which were intended to protect small providers, have teeth. Otherwise, we're going to see labour market efficiency suffering. The secrecy which has been adopted around the work programme is entirely counterproductive. It postpones, no doubt, minor ministerial embarrassment, but what a price is being paid. Nobody knows what's going on. Job centre managers have no idea what's happening in the work programme in their area, and that's one of the reasons for the very poor relationships between job centres and work programme providers that are being reported. In the New Deal and the Flexible New Deal, they used to work together. That appears to be the case in many areas no longer. Private sector providers, I know, want openness. It's not at their request that this secrecy has been adopted. They want to be able to benchmark performance against each other and have some sense of how they're getting on. Ministers have made it impossible for them to do so, and the programme is going to be less effective than it should have been as a result. Local authorities have been carved out altogether. That, I think, is another missed opportunity. The day one prisoner engagement appears in many areas to be a damp squib because prisons aren't ready. And of course, real questions have been raised about the viability of the scheme by the National Audit Office and others. And many people think that there are going to be some serious problems in the work programme in the course of this year. The second of these proposed panaceas, welfare reform, the introduction of universal credit. Now again, we support simplifying the benefit system. We've been clear on that from the publication of the first Green Paper and throughout the debates on the welfare reform bill. In government, we did a great deal to make sure people were better off in a job that are on benefits. Universal credit potentially can take that further, and we welcome that. But it isn't a panacea. It has again been oversold. For some people, actually, it's going to make work incentives significantly worse, particularly second earners in couples who are very important for increasing labour market participation. They will have they will keep much less money when they move into work under universal credit than is the case under tax credits. Universal credit is going to be less supportive of self-employment. And serious questions are being raised as well about whether universal credit can in fact be delivered by October next year. It's going to depend on monthly PAYE information coming to DWP from Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. We're told that the Major Projects Authority has just warned of critical weaknesses requiring immediate attention in the PAYE real-time information IT programme. Every business in the UK is supposed to be using this RTI arrangement by October of next year. Many of them haven't even heard about it yet, and yesterday a survey was published suggesting that 2/3 of companies asked think it should be implemented more slowly. There is a real risk that it's not going to be operating in every business in the country as it's supposed to by October of next year. And around universal credit, there's a frighteningly large number of key decisions that haven't been made yet. If you have to provide documentary evidence to support your universal credit application, will you go to the job centre or the local council? We just don't know. Which recipients of universal credit will in future be entitled to free school meals from October next year? No decision has been made. There are, I think, some worrying signs around all of this. A real danger that the upshot might be a significant undermining of confidence in the social security system. Our view, as Ed Miliband and Liam Byrne have both been arguing, is looking further ahead. We need to be looking for a more contributory, a more something for something approach to social security in the future. And thirdly, The government has been presenting an increase in the number of apprenticeships as the solution for skills policy. There certainly has been a significant increase in numbers on apprenticeships, though when you look at what is actually happening in those apprenticeships, the numbers look a good deal less encouraging. There's, I think, a real danger in what's going on at the moment of the apprenticeship brand being undermined, and support for people who are not young, who are nevertheless in need of help to get back into the labour market, appears not to be being delivered by the skills support system at all. So over the next couple of years, I think the real threat to the labour market is the lack of growth in the economy. That's going to continue to push up unemployment, and that will then make it harder because of hysteresis effects and the growth of long-term unemployment to get people back into work when growth does eventually come. We're building again a large cohort of long-term unemployment people, as in the 1980s, the early 1990s, and that's going to be a big problem for the labour market in the future, and a costly one to tackle. And the three policies that I referred to aren't going to make up for that fundamental weakness. Of course, there do have to be cuts. Over the last 2 years, I've supported, along with my colleagues in the House, a 2-year limit to contributory employment and support allowance for people in the work-related activity group, 3 years inflation indexing of local housing allowance, the regional form of benefit cap, temporary linking of benefits and pensions to the lower CPI index. Those cuts need to be made. Our argument, though, is over the pace at which the reduction of the deficit is supposed to take place. They are going too far and too fast, and the labour market has been one of the casualties. And Ed Balls has set out a 5-point plan to inject some momentum into the economy, a temporary VAT cut, a further cut to VAT on home improvements because the building industry is in such poor shape, reapplying Alistair Darling's bank bonus tax to secure funding for 110,000 jobs for young people and a programme of house building, bringing forward planned investment on infrastructure and a payroll tax cut for small businesses. We want to start to rebuild demand, renew confidence, and rekindle growth and job creation in the economy. But of course, in the longer term, the labour market faces huge challenges, arising in particular from demographic change and from emerging countries providing us with ever sharper competition. The Office for Budget Responsibility produced a long-term forecast last month. They estimated demographic change is going to push up public spending by £80 billion a year in 50 years' time. And if current estimates of life expectancy are off again, it's going to be more than that. Today, 1.4 working people for every child or pensioner. On current patterns of employment, that'll be 1.0 by 2050. The labour market has to change. And for example, we need more women in employment. The Resolution Foundation has pointed out a 4% gap between the rate of women's employment in the UK and in 14 OECD countries that perform better than us. A bigger gap with Scandinavia and Switzerland. We need to set about closing that gap. And that's why I think the decision to cut childcare support looks so counterproductive. Women's unemployment has hit new highs since that change was made. The Chartered Institute for Personnel and Development has pointed out this morning the problem isn't amongst older women, amongst younger women bringing up children. 44,000 fewer now are claiming help for childcare since those cuts were made. We do, I think, need to look fundamentally at whether our demand-led system of childcare support, the one that we developed in government, is the right approach. Supply-side childcare systems are in place in most of the countries with higher rates than ours of women's employment, and that's something our policy review is going to be looking at. And we need as well a skills strategy for an ageing population. The state pension age must not be a deadline for leaving employment. Older workers having problems finding a job mustn't be ignored. We need to support businesses to retrain older workers for new skills and for new workplaces. And again, I think there's a worry that funding cuts in further education, and one well understands why they've been made, but may well be counterproductive for that reason in particular. I met a group of students in a business society at the University of East London in my constituency. One of them asked if I regretted the target that 50% of young people should enter higher education. He felt degrees had become too common and so devalued. But I think with a long-term perspective, it's right that we do need to be aiming for that proportion, at least, of young people to have the benefits of higher education. Of course, there should be a discussion between business, government, education, about how to deliver skills that we need amongst young people and in the wider workforce. What fields do we need skills in? When do we want people to gain qualifications? How should they be structured? And businesses like Microsoft know best what we're going to be up against internationally. They're well placed, I think, to lead that discussion. But the UK is going to thrive, is going to succeed internationally if we have a better skilled workforce than others. We keep competing with India, China, with their ever increasing graduate workforces, new knowledge economies like South Korea. And it remains my view that we do need to aim high as others are aiming high, and we need to work out together how we can deliver ambitious goals for skills and for the labour market. So we face a huge short-term challenge because economic policy hasn't delivered, and we face enormous long-term challenges which we've got no chance of ducking. Developing skills, getting back on track for full employment, dismantling barriers to employment, those are approaches we are convinced can deliver for the UK, and we're going to be developing them in detail, of course, between now and the general election. Thank you.
I know we're running slightly behind schedule, but hopefully you've got time for a couple of questions.
Sure.
So perhaps we'll take 3 questions. Do we have a microphone? Maybe you can just shout. If you just say who you are and where you're from and what your question is, there's one there, lady that's there, then just
stand up. Yeah. Ruth Yeoman from Royal Holloway. Should we be concerned not just to get people into any kind of work at all, but with the quality of the work that people do? And should we perhaps then be thinking about bringing in some kind of a standard for decent, humane and dignified work for everybody, and how that would relate to creating a truly productive economy for the future?
Well, can we just take 3 in?
Sure.
Then there was one gentleman just there, yes.
Okay, sorry. Nick Davey, Association of Colleges. I noted your point about the 50% aspiration, and if you remember it was 18 to 30, and it was some form of higher education. The higher education system in Britain is absolutely dominated by the 3-year residential bachelor's degree, which is expensive and an enormous incentive for all colleges and universities to attract on that particular course. I just wonder if Labour have been thinking around any incentives that it could put in the system to have a much more diverse higher education and higher skills system.
Yeah. Should we be concerned about the quality of employment? Yes, I think we should. I mean, one thing we should be concerned about is the levels of wages that people have, and we've supported the increasing adoption of the living wage. But I don't think we should overlook the fact that for many people, the key step they need to make is to get into a job. And, I've spoken to large numbers of people, both when I was employment minister and since then, who tell me their life has been transformed by moving from unemployment, in some cases a long period of employment, into an entry-level job. That, I think, is the key transition that people need to make. And the more people we have who are long-term unemployed, the more costly it's going to be for them to be supported to make the transition into employment in the future. Of course, once they're in work, then we should be concerned about their progression and the quality of employment that they enjoy. But I don't think we should minimize or underestimate the crucial significance of getting into a job, particularly for young people, because we know that the penalty for them in later life from a long period of unemployment right at the beginning of their working life is a very big one, and a penalty not just for them individually but for the economy as well. And yes, I do agree that in looking at how we can increase participation in higher education, we need to be innovative in how that can be delivered. There need to, I think, to be a number of new models. We need new providers and some more innovation here and different providers, perhaps from the ones and the model that you've described accurately as the dominant one at the moment. And I do think we have to work out how we can provide incentives in the system to ensure that those different models are developed.
Conscious of time, but I'm going to squeeze in one question, if that's okay for myself. You talked about local authorities being squeezed out of things like the work programme, and I think at Policy Exchange, the one thing we're really conscious of is the need to join up the provision of employment support, both between the skills agenda, the employment agenda, across local government, justice, MOJ as well. And I wondered, with your experience at DWP and at the Treasury, whether you think having some kind of joined-up policy across Whitehall is ever a reality?
Well, it certainly can be difficult. You know, I remember as Employment Minister, David Lammy, who was Skills Minister at the time, and I worked closely together, but it was difficult to deliver a seamless policy between the two. I agree with you about the importance of doing it. I think we made some progress, but we didn't complete the task. My impression at the moment is that is significantly worse than it used to be, and I think it is very important that efforts to bring those policy areas together, to support efforts to enable people to get into work through the skills funding mechanism, those just aren't there at the moment, and they need to be. With local authorities, we did, before the election, make some headway with the development of things like city strategies. There was joint commissioning for employment support being tried out, and some examples of it happening. I think by accident, the procurement model for the work programme kind of shut all of that down entirely, and now it seems to be a kind of voluntary, or almost down to the relationships between individuals in the work programme providers and the local authorities in their area about whether local authorities are involved or not. And there are growing reports of some local authorities deciding that there's nothing in the work programme for them, and they'll go off and do something different. And I think that is going to weaken efforts to improve matters. So I think there should again be some serious work on looking at how local authorities can be involved jointly with DWP in procuring employment support. So, yep, I think efforts to join these things up should continue. Thank you.